Last time, we heard all about the origins of tea in the East, its disputed start in either China or India, and how it flourished across Asia thanks to the work of certain individuals like Bodhidharma, Lu Yu, and the Japanese monk Sai Cho. In this episode, we continue to follow the journey of tea as it makes its way to Europe and the Americas. We'll see the large role tea tends to play politically amongst rival nations, as well as internally in Tunisia. And we'll get to have a look at how this humble beverage has made its way to each and every corner of the globe. Welcome to the fantastic history of food. Strange but true stories from history that in some way involve food. I'm your host, Nick Charlie Key.
Hey, what's up everybody? It's Drew.
And Nick.
From the Appliance Educator podcast. Are you ever wondering, can my appliances actually be that interesting?
No, you don't ask yourself that question, but the answer is yes, it can.
Join Nick and I as we get to talk with all sorts of awesome guests, from celebrity chefs, your favorite YouTube DIYers, and appliance brand executives. You can catch us on YouTube or on your favorite podcast streaming platform.
And if you're on YouTube, check out all of our other great content.
Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Appliance Educator podcast.
One of today's sponsors is Athletic Greens. So what is Athletic Greens? Well, with one delicious scoop of Athletic Greens, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food-sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, your recovery, your focus, and aging. And best of all, it's lifestyle friendly. So whether you follow a keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free or gluten-free diet, Athletic Greens fits into all of them. It costs less than $3 a day, and for every purchase, Athletic Greens donates to organizations helping to get nutritious food to kids in need, including No Kid Hungry in the US. In 2020 alone, Athletic Greens donated over 1.2 million meals to kids. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with a convenient daily nutrition. It's just one scoop in a cup of water every day. That's it. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/emerging. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/EMERGING to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Tea began to appear in Western literature around the turn of the 9th century. However, it didn't gain full cultural popularity in the West until well into the 17th century, when the power of the European trading fleets swung into full effect. It was, however, the work of a Portuguese missionary who would be one of the first to bring tea back to Europe after a tour of China. Once the Dutch East India Company got wind of just how valuable the tea trade was, they raced to be first in line to deliver the first major shipments of tea back to Europe in 1610. As global trade opened up and trade routes became safer and more established, tea would make its way along the Silk Road, eventually culminating in Russia. By this time, as Europe began experiencing the joy of tea in the 16th and 17th centuries, it had already become a foregone conclusion that tea was meant to be drunk with hot water, as opposed to being something one would chew. Famous British diarist Samuel Pepys even wrote about his first experience with what he called the Chinese drink in 1660. When stories began to come to light of Dutch sailors who would chew the tea leaves for prolonged periods of time before swallowing them, they were ridiculed and taunted as imbeciles who didn't know how common foodstuffs worked, ironically unaware of tea's original method of consumption in the East. In another twist of fate that would go in the Dutch sailors' favor, it is believed that this very practice of chewing and eating the tea leaves may have aided them in preventing scurvy, which affected many long-haul sailors of that era. Even to this day, there are still inhabitants of the eastern Himalayas who continue to enjoy the practice of eating the leaves. It is a tradition passed down to them from their ancestors, the Palawang tribe, who would steam and wrap tea in leaves before burying them in deep pits to pickle over time. Once several months had passed, the pickled tea leaves were ready to be eaten in a type of tea-based salad. Back in Europe, however, and as tea first made its way into mainstream society, it was very much considered a luxury, and its consumption was mainly restricted to the aristocratic classes. Owing to its Eastern heritage and its association with Buddhist monasteries, it gave the drink an overwhelming sense of allure that marked it in society as something important and desirable. A few decades later, and coffee's stranglehold on society began to loosen, as tea became more and more available to the masses. A man named Thomas Garraway was the first to open a cafe exclusively serving a variety of tea leaves imported by the Dutch East India Company. But tea only truly skyrocketed to universal British popularity when Charles II married the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza. She was a lover of tea and began the tradition that lasts until this very day of an afternoon tea consumption that we all attribute to British culture. The British began to realize, however, that they were overly dependent on the Dutch imports as well as the Chinese trade routes the Dutch owned. The Dutch could ask any price they wanted, and demand meant that the British would have to pay. The only logical solution in the British government's mind was to start importing it themselves so they could control the flow and the pricing, while also making a tidy profit of their very own. So the British East India Company was born, and their first tea stronghold in the East was on the island of Macau. By the early 18th century, however, with many scuffles, conflicts and political maneuvering, the British had monopolized the tea trade from China, wresting control of it away from the Dutch. Not content now to merely buy from existing tea producers, they wanted an even larger slice of the pie, and to do that meant to begin producing tea themselves from scratch. So they began employing tea-growing experts from China and taking them across to India and the subcontinent. They established hubs in what was then Bombay and Bengal and spread outwards from there. And by 1823, black tea in the Assam and Darjeeling regions was in full swing, with hills and valleys covered in tea plantations as far as the eye could see. As production here ramped up, they were producing so much of their own tea that their reliance on Chinese tea was broken, and they were able to negotiate even better terms for themselves now that they no longer fully relied on them. When tea began to cross the Atlantic to America, it was originally through Dutch traders, but in the years to come, the British would also usurp this trade route as well. However, things would not stay easy or profitable for long. The British East India Company had now spread themselves just a little bit too thin, having to defend themselves from all sides from threats to their business. The knock-on effect of this unfortunate reality was that they began imposing large taxes and duties on the tea imports to cover their massive running costs. Naturally, the Americans were not too happy about this in the slightest, and unfortunately, it came amidst an already rising tide of tension across the colonies. Americans were not happy about being taxed by a government with whom they had no sway, influence, or even a voice, and the idea of no taxation without representation was born. This would lead to one of the biggest tea-based tragedies in history, and would ultimately be the spark that would ignite the American Revolutionary War of Independence. In late 1773, 7 ships carrying tea set out to make their deliveries to the American colonies. 4 ships were bound for Boston, and 1 each were bound for New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Altogether, the ships carried around 2,000 chests of tea, weighing nearly 600,000 pounds. While the ships were already en route, word began to spread to the colonies about the Tea Act. This would mean higher taxes and duties for a people already struggling to establish themselves. The grumbling began slowly, but within just a few days it had worked itself up to a fully fledged protest movement, led by a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, protesters successfully managed to get those in power who would enforce the new laws to resign. The tea that had landed was seized by customs officials, and the ship bound for New York, delayed by bad weather, arrived to an unwelcome port, and promptly turned around and sailed back to England with their full cargo. Boston, however, was a different story entirely. The governor there, a man named Hutchinson, refused to back down in the face of this uprising, and 2 of the men charged with enforcing the laws were his sons, and so he compelled them not to back down either. When the ship named the Dartmouth arrived in Boston Harbor in late November, party leader Samuel Adams called for a mass meeting that resolved together that the ship would not be allowed to unload its cargo, and in doing so incur the duties that would be owed to the British. Adams and his group urged the captain of the Dartmouth to leave and sail back to England with his cargo. They even assigned a rotating watch of 25 men to guard the dock to make sure the ship did not unload its cargo. Governor Hutchinson refused to grant permission for the Dartmouth to leave without paying the duties owed to the Crown. And while this standoff was simmering, 2 more ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver, also arrived in Boston Harbor, full to the brim with tea. On December 16th, the last day of the Dartmouth's deadline to leave, about 7,000 people met to listen to Samuel Adams's plan. When they found out that Hutchinson had again refused to let the ships leave, they felt they were left with no choice. Samuel Adams tried his best to regain control of the meeting, but the people were far too riled up to listen, and they poured out of the meeting hall prepared to take action. Later that evening, around 130 men donned disguises and boarded the 3 vessels. For the next 3 hours, they began methodically dumping more than 340 chests of tea into the harbour waters, amounting to just under 100,000 pounds of tea, for a monetary loss in today's money of around $1.7 million. And so, the legend of the Boston Tea Party was born. Knowing that most teas only need a few minutes to steep, I do fear, however, that the harbour waters would have been somewhat overbrewed. But from this day onwards, American tea-drinking culture began to be seen as somewhat unpatriotic, which accounts today for the lingering effects of the overwhelming cultural shift towards coffee as their beverage of choice. In fact, today, still 80% of all tea consumption in America is either iced tea or the southern equivalent known as sweet tea. Taking the next step in your life takes courage. Whether you are an individual, an organization, or a corporation, Dr. Binyamin Klempner, or Dr. B for short, is going to help you take that next step. You are the star of your story, and no matter what your goals are, Dr. B will help you reach them. He works in highly structured, highly focused one-on-one sessions in either 6 or 12-week modules. You will choose a goal, dive into an expressive project, and uncover more about your inner archetypes and how to utilize them in moving you forward towards your goals, while at the same time understanding why certain aspects of them may be what's holding you back from taking that next step. For more information or to book your sessions with Dr. B, go to yourcoachdrb.weebly.com or simply click the links in the show notes for this episode to read more about his process, or even contact him directly via the WhatsApp link. And take control back today.
Hello! We're here to tell you about a new podcast called No Bad Reviews, a coffee podcast. We're 3 pals, and we also work in the coffee industry, so we know a little thing or two about coffee.
Hint of something else. And if you're saying it's Hobby Lobby, I'll go with that.
We are checking out coffees that we might prefer to give a bad review to, but we're going to find a way to say something good about them.
What's the opposite of a hint? I'm getting beat over the head with dark coffee.
And while we're at it, we're all going to learn a little bit of history. Even when you go to outer space, they will go to extreme lengths to make coffee as much like it is at home. Let's go ahead and get this party started.
You can find No Bad Reviews, a coffee podcast on your favorite podcasting app.
Let's jump back across the ocean now to North Africa, and specifically to Tunisia. Tea had first been introduced to the country near the turn of the 20th century, while it was still a French colony. It didn't immediately take off in the country and was practically unknown before the advent of World War I. However, between the years of 1917 and 1926, the imports of tea rose from just 100,000 kilograms to well over 1 million. As soldiers from Europe were stationed in the coastal country as a key military base point, they brought their love of tea and tea-drinking traditions with them. To the Tunisian government, however, this was not a harmless byproduct. It was potentially a societal scourge that needed to be monitored. In fact, in 1927, a French-trained Tunisian doctor stood up at a meeting of the Academy of Medicine in Paris and spoke about an addictive intoxicant that was spreading like an oil stain across Tunisia. He pleaded with the French authorities to do something about it, as he feared that, were it not to be stopped soon, it would eventually paralyze Tunisian society. French authors also began urging the government to step in, as they said that Tunisian men, women, and even children were drinking tea unhindered each day without any sense of moderation or restraint. One journal entry from 1930 had the following to say: "The harm that tea causes is especially visible in the countryside, where it weakens the race, who are literally intoxicated, as well as being morally and physically diminished." French academics and doctors named this phenomenon teaism and listed it as an official medical diagnosis. Part of this medical classification was the belief that all uneducated Tunisians had an inherent lack of self-control, coupled with the fact that they were continuously and ignorantly preparing the wrong kind of tea in the wrong kind of way. This is interesting to me because, knowing that they themselves were all tea drinkers in some capacity too, they had to find a way to make sure that it wasn't actually tea drinking itself that was the problem, rather just the kind of tea being drunk. Teaism was said to be an addiction comparable to alcoholism, and along with it came tremors, amnesia, palpitations, blurred vision, nervous system complications, and a general weakening of the body. Some physicians of the time even went so far as to say it would cause hallucinations, delusions, and in extreme cases, terminal psychosis. It was an alarming reaction from the government and from medical professionals that at first glance seems to be coming from a misguided sense of care and welfare for the lower classes. However, unfortunately, as with most of these sorts of faux altruism, when you begin to scratch the surface, you generally tend to find less complimentary reasons behind their protestations. In documents written by one medical professional to a government official, they describe how the lower classes' addiction to tea meant that they would do almost anything to satisfy their habits. According to the author, the whole salary of many Tunisian workers was spent on the purchase of tea and sugar, and when their money ran out, these crazed tea addicts would sell their last possessions, steal from their employers, their friends, and even their family. This assertion was enough to scare the daylights out of French authorities, as they believed these workers under the vice-like grip of tea addiction were well on their way to becoming criminals. In another interesting turn of events, the effects of this addiction were said to be so strong that even court cases were being argued that criminals who had committed murder or even manslaughter may not be legally responsible if they were considered to be under the influence of tea. The French doctor Henri-Paul Joseph Renaud wrote in 1928 of a case of a 22-year-old Tunisian who had murdered his parents. He wrote that the unfortunate event had taken place during a tea-induced hallucination attack after consuming 100 grams of tea in just one day. And nowadays, we are well aware that the so-called teaism is not an actual malady and does not produce hallucinations or lead its drinkers into a life of crime. As the years have gone by, it's become more and more clear that what was really happening was that for the French authorities, seeing so many members of their colony drinking tea began to hit a bit of a nationalist nerve for them, as they viewed tea as a predominantly British drink. Tea was seen as unfortunate proof of British influence creeping into their territory, when at that time coffee was still the national drink of France, being that it was a major export from their colonies in Martinique and the Reunion Islands. Thankfully for Tunisia, they ended up gaining their independence in 1956, and from then onwards, the people have been free to drink as much tea as they like, making it nowadays the de facto national drink of Tunisia. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Fantastic History of Food. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find us on Twitter at Food History Pod. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate you taking a moment to rate the show on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on, and if you can, leave a review as well. I also have a Patreon account where you can support the show and get access to exclusive content, bonus episodes, and even the chance to choose the topic for an upcoming episode. But all of this is only for our Patreon subscribers. Everyone who donates or subscribes will also get a personal shout-out from me on an upcoming episode. check out our website where you can find transcripts, show notes, and references for each and every episode at foodhistorypodcast.com.